much for inviting me. It's always nice to be in Dublin, but it's actually interesting to be here now because, on the basis, admittedly, of 24 hours, it strikes me that the mood here is actually, if anything, rather more optimistic than I imagined, and more optimistic than some of the other European capitals I've been to. And recently, I mean, in Warsaw, there's a kind of state of suppressed panic about what's going on in Russia. France, in the wake of the Charlie Hebdo things, but also a wider sense of national malaise. I think the Germans, even though the economy is not as weak as others, feel weighed down by the various issues that they're having to deal with. And I think it is a very troubled period in Europe. I was trying to wonder whether, perhaps I was being a bit hysterical in saying to myself that it's more troubled than any period I can remember as a journalist. I've been kind of working now since the mid-'80s. But I think that probably is right. And I think the reason is that we're facing three simultaneous crises, each of which on their own would be a major concern. But to have to deal with Russia, with the implosion of the Middle East, and with the Euro crisis simultaneously is a very tall order. And then I think you said, is there a fourth crisis? And I think there is, but it's the question of the rise of nationalism, or another way of putting it is the sort of fracturing of the political centre, is where those previous three crises meet. And that's one of the themes of what I'm going to try and say today, is that although in many ways Russia, the Middle East, the Euro crisis, they have very different roots, very different patterns, the common denominator, it seems to me, is that they're helping to fracture politics as we've known it, where for some decades now you've had a kind of mainstream agreement, centrist domination of European politics in the major countries at least, that has then actually been, without us quite realizing it, critical to the functioning of the European Union, because when you have these 28 countries meeting, it's very important that you don't have too many Syrizas or, God forbid, national fronts around the table. If that starts to happen, then the European Union itself, I think, is under serious threat. But what I'd like to do, and I think you wanted me to talk for about like half an hour and then do a Q&A, is to do a little bit on each of the crises and then to try to draw the threads together at the end. Take your pick which you find most worrying. Personally, I find what's happening with Russia the thing that's preoccupied me most over the last year, because the risks are probably greatest there of actually leading to war. It's still a strong outside chance. It's not something that's I think highly likely, but it's possible enough to be of a real concern. And it comes down to now, I think it's a question we've been asking now for more than a year, but it seems to be getting more acute rather than less acute, which is what does Putin want, what does Russia want? And then connected to that, how does the West respond as events unfold? Have we got it right? Are we making it worse? And I think that one of the things that makes one anxious about Russia is that so far Putin has shown a consistent ability to surprise on the downside, in the sense that if you look back at how we were assessing this crisis over the last 15 months, consistently people who should know, kind of experts, were saying, oh, well, he won't do that, and then he does it. So that I remember just ahead of the annexation of Crimea, we ran an article, or possibly it was just a letter in the FT from a former British ambassador who said the idea that Putin will annex Crimea is a dark fantasy, and in a week he'd done it. And then people said, okay, well, Crimea was perhaps a special case, but surely he won't now start the incursions into eastern Ukraine, and now that's happened. And then the next question is, well, will he attempt to build this land bridge to Crimea by annexing down the coast? I think that's looking quite likely. Certainly the latest ceasefire has never took hold, and it didn't break down. It never really started. And then the questions to come are all this rhetoric about Novorossiya. Is there going to be an effort to try to carve out really a significant chunk of Ukraine and turn it into either a quasi-independent state under the control of Moscow or annex it? you can't really write that off. I mean, the extent to which that's now a feature of Russian rhetoric is very striking. And then the biggest worry, obviously, is the Baltic states. And that is because they're in NATO. And at that point, the risk of war really does arise if there's Russian aggression against countries that are covered by the Article 5 security guarantee. And again, that really does fall into the surely he wouldn't ... category. And I still think it unlikely if we kind of keep our nerve. But certainly if you go to Warsaw or to the Baltic states, you get a very different perspective there. I mean, I think they think it is quite likely, actually, that they have a very dark view of what Russia is up to. And it's a view that it becomes harder to refute. I mean, the last time I was in Warsaw, I had a similar sort of conversation with the now ex-Foreign Secretary Sikorski, who said, look, a year ago when I said he would go after Crimea, he would go into Ukraine, you all said to me I was crazy, and actually it's happened. So now, listen to us when we say the next step is going to be to try to destabilize the Baltic states. And you could see how that could happen in the sense that there are Russian minorities there that can be stoked up in the way that the Russian minorities in eastern Ukraine were. And the West then gets into a classic deterrence dilemma. Do we move troops into the Baltic states on a permanent basis as a sign of our kind of determination not to let that happen? Is that regarded as a provocation in Russia? You're familiar with the arguments, but the debate has already moved into territory that is kind of startling. I mean, the extent to which the Russians are now prepared to use nuclear weapons as an explicit part of the kind of package of deterrence they're trying to push in our faces is very interesting. I mean, I was at a meeting in Washington a couple of months ago where there were quite a lot of diplomats there and just a few journalists, and there was a Russian... I think it's fair to call him a spokesman. I mean, he was actually a think tanker, but I think he'd been sent there with a message. And he gave a presentation, there were American diplomats opposite him, about what was going to happen. And the sentence that sort of stuck in my head was when he said, you have to realize that Putin has put the nuclear gun on the table. And that was obviously, a threat and meant to be taken as such. And everyone in the room sort of took a step backwards, metaphorically anyway. And then the Americans said, well, I'm very sorry to hear that, Dmitry. And that made me laugh because it was actually more or less, I think, a direct quote from Dr. Strangelove, which... So we really are in peculiar territory. So we were in the sort of I'm very sorry to hear that, Dmitry territory. But this is the kind of language one didn't expect to hear in modern Europe, and it gives you a sense of the tensions that are out there. Now, it's obviously in Russia's interests to look as scary as possible, and that is why you're getting these overflights and this nuclear rhetoric. But one can't completely dismiss it because, as I say, Putin has already shown himself to be more erratic, certainly in Western terms, than we had imagined. Now, the big question, I think, is that's going to a lot of the debate's going to focus on in the next 6 months, if, as looks likely, the ceasefire does not take hold and fighting continues, is what does the West do, and do we arm the Ukrainians? And I should say that comment about Putin has put the nuclear gun on the table was explicitly about this question of do you supply arms to the Ukrainians? And it was a threat aimed at persuading us not to do that. And the argument was that if Western weapons are being used to kill Russians, that will, I hesitate to use the word make Putin go ballistic in this context, but it will anger him, and the stakes will be upped. And at that point, I think the chap involved said, we could well go all the way to Ukraine. Anyway, you go to Kiev and actually occupy it. So the West will have to figure out whether we do this. There's a much livelier debate about it in Washington, or rather a bigger push, I think, to arm the Ukrainians in Washington than there is in Europe. I think Merkel probably speaks for most of the European governments when she says we're not going to do that. But we're moving into an electoral cycle in the US where the Republicans, certainly I think the kind of McCain wing of the Republican Party, will make this an emblem of Obama/democratic weakness. Obama, rather to my surprise, has started to talk about it at least as a possibility. And that will then lead to this question, first of all, how will the Russians react if the Americans actually do it? And secondly, whether will we be able to keep Western unity, which so far has been reasonably impressive on Ukraine amidst all the strains. If the Americans start arming the Ukrainians, will the Europeans at that point say, look, we're not with you on this? And does that then weaken one of the few things we've got in the West, which has been this ability to present a united front? I mean, I think that the first step will be more sanctions, and there is more we can do. There's this famous SWIFT ban on the Russian use of electronic money transfers, which sounds pretty technical, but was used against Iran with enormous effect. And the Russians clearly are extremely worried about it. We know this because the Russian ambassador showed up at the FT offices and said they would regard it as the equivalent of an act of war if we cut them out of the SWIFT financial system. So that was a fairly clear sign that they were concerned about it. But SWIFT is at the, as one American put it to me who's involved in all this, if you think of sanctions on a list of 1 to 10, SWIFT would be 10. And he said, so far we're only about 2 or 3. So there's a lot more that can be done. And I suspect that while keeping the weaponry issue as a threat, we're probably going to go for more economic sanctions. But even there's a question about whether in the European Union we can keep that consensus, because there are clearly countries that want even the current sanctions lifted. The Greeks have been most vociferous, but I think that's probably the Italian position as well. And the Italians, a big country, they matter. The French possibly too. So I think that the overall picture is of a worsening of the situation on the ground in eastern Ukraine, and a sense that Western unity on this, and a Western sense of that we know how to deal with this and can maintain a united front, is going to come under increasing strain over the next year or so. Meanwhile, you have the euro crisis going on, which is also obviously threatening to fracture the European Union. And I thought it was very striking that Merkel had to fly from 48 hours talking to the Russians in Minsk straight to Brussels to then try to deal with Tsipras and Syriza and so on. And as a journalist, I suppose it's good times in one sense that you can take your pick. You've got Russia, Greece, the Middle East. There's never a moment when you don't have a crisis to write about. And it's quite interesting trying to work out, well, which one should we be most worried about? Because, as I say, with Russia, the sort of catastrophic scenarios are easily the most catastrophic, but possibly, they're still at the 10% chance level, whereas the euro crisis, the chances of the euro actually breaking up, I think, have risen substantially. Now, as you say, we'll find out today whether a deal will be done over Greece. I suspect they'll do it, and that they will keep the show on the road for now. But I think that you'd have to be naive to believe that that's it. I think the problem is that we've now those of us who've argued that there are big structural flaws in the euro and that these are going to keep coming back to haunt us. I hesitate to use the word vindicated, but that argument's certainly looking a lot stronger year by year. And a package deal to keep the Greeks in is not going to address those fundamental issues. Now, I'm sure everybody's familiar with the arguments about whether the euro was an optimal currency area and whether it's actually structurally damaging the countries of southern Europe. It seems to me that certainly for some of them, for a country like Italy, which has used devaluation and inflation as kind of key tools for managing their debt, managing their competitiveness, to have those taken away has proved very damaging. I mean, it's not the only problem Italy's had. They've got the run-up of debt because of the financial crisis. They've got competition from China and so on, which has hollowed out their manufacturing base. The Italians have lost 25% of industrial capacity since the beginning of the crisis. This is a huge blow, and those kinds of issues are not going to go away if we get a package deal in Brussels. And they lead to the questions of, well, what are the bigger structural solutions one could arrive at. And one of the reasons that I was always skeptical of the EU's project for the single currency was a very kind of simple chain of logic, which was to argue that currency unions tend not to survive unless you have a political union, and that I never really believed we would get to a political union within the EU, and therefore I kind of believe that in the long run it won't last. It's a fairly simple chain of logic, but if you put those arguments to people in Brussels, certainly the time I was there, which was 2001, 2005, you tended to get one of two responses. The first was, well, just because most monetary unions, almost all, are backed by a political union, doesn't mean you have to have that, and we've set up all these arrangements, and you see it'll work. That was one set of arguments, but actually it's not working, so I think it's pretty clear you do need structural reforms. The second argument was that, well, if we create the monetary union, the political union will follow, that the logic for it will become apparent, and you'll get a transfer union because you'll just need it. And I think that's where we're reaching a breakdown status, because I think it's become apparent when the Germans were told there won't be a transfer union. People took that at face value, and they're really not up for a transfer union. And the spectacle of what's going on in Greece makes them less and less willing to sign up to the kind of big fiscal transfers that underpin, say, the dollar in the United States. So we're likely to be stuck with a monetary union that's backed by an EU budget that's just 1% of GDP, as opposed to a federal budget which is 19% of GDP in the United States, without the transfer union. And with these big competitiveness issues across the monetary union. And that seems to me to be a recipe for continued political unrest and continued discontent, so that even if we manage to get our way past this current crisis, the underlying factors which make the Eurozone crisis-prone are still there and unlikely to be rectified. So, moving right along to the Middle East, that I think also is contributing to this overall sense of crisis within Europe, because the whole of the southern border, the other side of the Mediterranean, is obviously in turmoil. And for a while it felt that could be ignored, or at least the European Union is doing its level best to ignore it. But there are two things that are making that a harder position to maintain. One is the growing fear of terrorism and the extent that you get a kind of backwash of people who've either directly been radicalized by going to fight in Syria or elsewhere, or who've been radicalized by the internet and the kind of propaganda that's coming out of that region. And that is then feeding directly into fear of terrorism, and also social tensions within our own societies about immigration and the rise of anti-immigration parties. You know the formula. Then, of course, there is the flow of migrants, which has become very intense. And I mentioned the problems of Italy economically. Well, Italy is also at the forefront of this. I think there were 100,000 people showed up on the shores of Italy in the first 6 months of 2014. There are, as you know, hundreds of people dying in the Mediterranean. It is a humanitarian disaster, and one which we are very far from coming up with either a coherent European response or really a response of any sort. And it doesn't seem to me likely that that's going to get any better in the short run either, because what's happened is the implosion of Libya as a functioning state. Libya has now become the transshipment point for people, not just from North Africa, but all the way back from Eritrea, Niger, countries whose issues we're barely aware of in Europe, but which are becoming increasingly things that we're going to have to engage with. And yet, at the same time, I think European countries have never been less willing to put boots on the ground to intervene. The faith that we can sort this stuff out by doing that is really down to negligible. And we were talking downstairs about Britain's kind of withdrawal from international affairs, and you can cite that in various dimensions. There's the fact that we're obviously not players in the Euro crisis. The British are not really involved in the Ukraine negotiations, even though they were signatories of the Budapest Memorandum. But for me, it's almost most striking because it was on this watch that the Libyan, Cameron's watch, that the Libyan intervention took place. And there's now almost no discussion in the UK, perhaps because of a sense of embarrassment, of what happened in Libya subsequently. No suggestion that we might have some kind of responsibility for trying to sort it out. You could argue that, well, maybe we don't, but there's not even a debate. And I think that reflects a profound lack of belief after Afghanistan, after Iraq, and now after Libya, that this is possible. But that then leads to a kind of sense of helplessness that would prefer just not to think about it because it's just too difficult. And if Britain, which is, along with France, one of the two major military powers in the EU, has completely lost its appetite for these kinds of interventions or stability operations at a time when actually, arguably, they've never been needed more, then the chances of Europe coming up with a coherent solution to this, I think, are pretty negligible. So the question then becomes, well, what's going to happen in the Middle East itself? And I was talking to colleagues who follow the whole question of IS much more closely than I do, and they think that in Iraq itself, actually, the American-led bombing campaign has, if nothing else, at least contained the problem. So the idea that they're not actually making territorial gains, they may be forced out of Mosul. Syria, we're in this awful paradoxical situation where I think the West is now, having almost bombed Assad in 2012, is now in a tacit alliance with him. And one of the things that's happened is that at the time of the Arab Spring, I think that the West sort of briefly, sorry if the West is a broad term, but I think in this case it is kind of applicable. There was a sort of joint European-American view that, maybe we found the key to solving our moral strategic dilemmas in the Middle East, because we know that the false stability of dictatorship is a false stability, and also it makes us feel bad because we're sort of conniving with all sorts of horrible dictators. And now we can have a democracy, and that'll kind of sort out the problems of the Middle East, and we can even feel better about it. So that's great. Now we've really kind of abandoned that. There's essentially the Egyptian counter-coup has been endorsed, although Sisi is far from being pro-American. He's still regarded as certainly better than the alternative. And watching Sisi at Davos recently, it did strike me, is it conceivable that in 5 years' time Assad will be speaking at Davos? I don't think it's inconceivable. There's that much sort of cynicism taking hold. I mean, I think that the debate isn't settled, actually, from what I know of the arguments in Washington. There are people inside the administration who say, look, we've just now got to accept that we are effectively in tacit alliance with Assad and that it is not in our interest for him to go. Maybe we could lever him out and get a sort of another Ba'athist general in charge, but possibly even that's not possible because actually if you take those kinds of regimes, if you take the figurehead out, they tend to collapse anyway. So that might be too risky. Let's just accept, unpleasant as it is, that's where our interests lie. IS are a threat to us, a direct threat to us. Assad isn't. So let's go with that. But I think that there's still pushback against that view. John Kerry, and the last I heard, was still arguing that actually, no, we have to sincerely get Assad out and that the Syrian moderates are the way to go. But not many people believe that they're capable of holding the ring. So American policy, even in Syria, is confusing and confused. It's as is European policy insofar as there is one. And then if you look at the broader Middle East, I mean, the US and the West are on every side of the argument, so that they're sanctioning Iran, but in a tacit alliance with Iran in Iraq. They're opposed to Iran in Syria. So what are we trying to do? I don't think anybody really knows. And meanwhile, the situation continues to deteriorate on the ground. Not everywhere, as I say. The military situation in Iraq is better than it was a few months ago, but I think Libya is now the big worry because what Al-Qaeda and now IS have always wanted is a real nice failed state where they can operate freely. And Afghanistan was quite a long way away, but Libya is right on the shores of the Mediterranean and looks very much like it's meeting that bill. So that's crisis 3. And as I said, I think that the danger for Europe is that those crises are merging in the sense that they're helping to destabilize mainstream politics within the European Union. Now, how is that happening? Well, you have various revolts. You have the revolt against austerity going on, and that's connected to the euro crisis, obviously, and that's epitomized by Syriza in Greece, but it's also Podemos in Spain and a host of other left and right-wing parties which have been making gains, and Syriza was the first one to actually take power at a national level. And as we're all aware, one of the reasons that governments from Ireland to Spain to Italy are not willing to give them any ground is precisely because they fear encouraging the Syriza-like parties in their own countries. How that plays out, we'll see over the next year, but there clearly has been perhaps a slightly delayed reaction to the financial crisis of 2008, the economic fallout, but it's now happening, and you are getting left-wing, anti-capitalist, in broad terms, parties coming forward. You then have the revolt against immigration, which is fueling the far right, and just jotting down the parties who would fall into that category, where you have the National Front in France, you have UKIP in the UK. At the kind of fascistic end of things, you have Golden Dawn in Greece, the Sweden Democrats, who I'm told are pretty nasty characters, who are up to about 10% in Sweden. The Danish People's Party, you have a similar party in Norway, which is actually in government. So it's the Northern League in Italy. If anything, that's more ubiquitous than the anti-austerity parties. And one of the things that actually unites the far right and the far left is the surprising extent to which they're pro-Russia, or pro-Putin. So that if you looked at the people who sent along so-called observers to the kind of slightly phony referendum in Crimea, they included Die Linke from Germany, but also the Front National in France. So the far left and the far right seem to share some kind of soft spot for Putin. And it's not just Die Linke in Germany. The Mélenchon in France is also fairly pro-Putin. And there are others. And I think for the left, maybe it's just a residual kind of sympathy for Russia. Syriza is obviously the other example. Possibly it's to do with a sense that anything the EU is opposed to, they're in favor of. And I think that certainly is the case for the far right, that if you look at the rhetoric of rhetoric's too strong a word, they were kind of throwaway comments by Nigel Farage, but quite telling comments. I mean, his initial reaction to the Ukraine crisis, because he sees everything through the prism of the EU and his dislike of the EU, was to say, well, this is all the EU's fault, and therefore to slightly revel in the extent to which Putin was pushing back against the EU. And that's certainly very much part of the Marine Le Pen reaction to it. She's become pretty close to Putin. Indeed, I think he's, I don't know whether it's actually confirmed that the Russians are funding the National Front or just one of those things that's out there, but there clearly is a close relationship. So for the right, it's Putin's hostility to the EU, it's a taste for nationalism as opposed to supranationalism, it's also social conservatism, the whole kind of anti-gay bit plays into the social conservatism of the far right. And there are some parties which have managed to combine all three of those kind of themes that are appealing to the extremes: the anti-austerity, the revolt against immigration, and the pro-Russian bit. The National Front in France are the main example of a party that's actually managed to assimilate all three of those themes. And the question is, how threatening is this? Are these parties kind of signs of distress, economic and political distress in Europe, but they're manageable, they're not going to really do much damage, they'll stay at the 20% or so level and then gradually subside? Or are they a threat to, could some of them take power? And or if they, even if they don't take power, could they so affect the way that the political discourse is carried out that they make the EU harder to operate? I mean, you can see an element of that in the UK. We were talking downstairs about, well, what does Cameron want? What does he want with the European Union? I mean, I think it's very domestically politically driven. It's driven by the rise of UKIP and splits within his own party, and really he just needs something that's going to make that go away, and that then makes him behave in a way that his European partners find very difficult. And so you don't necessarily need these parties to take power for them to start driving the political agenda. Another example would be the hardening of, say, Sarkozy's rhetoric on immigration, which is clearly a response to the kind of attempt to take away some of the ground from the National Front. So they're changing the discourse already, but I think it becomes potentially critical when a far-right or far-left party actually gets hold of power in a European Union government. And when I've sort of tried to think through in my own mind, well, you know, if the euro collapses, or God forbid the European Union itself collapses, what would the mechanism be? What would be the trigger event if that happened? And it's always seemed to me that the real danger is if you get the collapse of the consensus among the 28 governments that's tended to get us through crises. Because however bad it's been, if you've had a European Council where essentially there are 28 countries, or the most important ones, committed to somehow sorting it out because they believe in the European project, you've tended to get to the other side of it. But if you have a European Council where there are parties that really don't accept the idea of the European Union, or really have ideas that are so radical that the others can't accept them, then you're in trouble. And we've got a first taste of that trouble with Syriza, which is why, as we were saying, it's been such an important test case and why people are so unprepared to give it ground. And I think that with Syriza, essentially, I mean, you know, I'm tempting fate, we'll find out tonight, but my guess is that they will essentially be forced to back down. And in that sense, there'll be a sort of sigh of relief and, well, you know, these radical guys, they didn't get anywhere and that's all fine. But the question is, the thing is, Syriza are too isolated and operating from too weak a starting position, both as a small country and a country on the point of bankruptcy. They have no leverage. So they're pretty easy to shove back into their box. Again, tempting fate, maybe that won't happen. But what if there were several Syrizas around the table? Or what if it was a country that was actually a large country, you know, a national front government, God forbid, in France? Then I think at that point the EU actually does become inoperable. And that's why I think all these three crises and the way they're merging together are a threat to us. I mean, I talked at the beginning about the really kind of blood-curdling threats, you know, war with Russia, massive terrorism, that kind of thing. But I think that the most plausible threat, certainly from the situation we're at now, is just an erosion of our institutions, a radicalization of politics to the extent to which the European Union itself, which has, for all its flaws, been the kind of framework in which politics has operated in Europe for the last 40 years and more, and has been terribly important for bringing Europe together after the end of the Cold War. If that begins to erode and break down, then I think we're in a new situation domestically and internationally, and one which is not particularly favourable. So I'll stop there, but I'd be happy to take questions, particularly ones that tell me that I'm wrong and it's all going to be fine.